Is coming. Okay. Um, and the interesting mechanical properties of what you get out, mechanical and dynamical properties of what you get out of this. And I think this is being stretched in various directions by what we've heard in the morning. So I'm not even quite sure how to think of Seth's talk in this framework, but should we be thinking sort of phase and gradients of phase as the equivalents of taking something and making it into directed motion?
It belongs to the same session in the sense that it is active. What does active matter mean? I mean, to some extent, anything which transforms shapes, color, to me is active matter. It doesn't have to be living.
No. I don't think I'm suggesting it should be living, but I was just suggesting it's a system with a different degree of freedom that I'm used to thinking of. And the question is, can you get something new and interesting by thinking of these degrees of freedom rather than motion? And for me, another new thing that came up today is sort of roles of boundaries and how you attach yourself with boundaries, how you structure yourself with boundaries in both your talk and in Jacques' talk in finite sizes and boundaries play such a new and important role.
I mean, in my stuff too, the interfaces between the different orientations of the collagen fibers, I think, I think the idea is that we want to, one of the simulations that Kate Storm, one of our collaborators, is running, is to basically look to see whether or not an interface of orientation can lead to a different mechanical property at that interface. And so I think the local sort of mechanics, I mean, that was one thing that I appreciated from Jacques' talk, was that the local mechanics was very important. And I guess in the other two talks, you also saw these, I guess, concentrations of stuff that happened at these interfaces that were quite interesting. I don't know if that's a common thread, but that was at least something that I picked up.
So is it your sense that things happen at boundaries as a result of the kind of activity they were showing? Is this how structure builds up? So we saw, for example, in Arshad's talk that basically you're sort of driven into this state where you have certain kinds of attachments and boundaries. And so you were asked whether this is active in the sense of, certainly in terms of just the matrix, the mechanical properties of the matrix is important. But is the same kinds of activity we heard about important, do you think, in setting up this structure?
Yeah, I don't, right. So the issue of how cartilage is set up is pretty complicated. From what I understand, in the beginning you have some sort of very collagenous, in fact the whole bone is basically collagen, and then it ossifies from, or calcifies rather, from one end. So I don't know exactly how this whole signaling takes place, but there is clearly a mechanical part to the signaling that I think we're going to hear about later in the conference, and certainly has been shown to happen. And there's obviously a chemical part, and I think that's kind of where we're heading, right? We have to start to understand something about how chemical and mechanical signals operate in order to really have a better understanding of these concepts.
I guess if you ask some people, they might say everything is chemical and all cues are chemical, whereas I think you can get very far with just mechanical organizations and mechanical entropic effects which are not chemical.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, the other side is also not, it's not all mechanical either. Right?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
So there's going to be this mix, and it's going to be an interesting story to see how it all goes out.
Is there some obvious signature of when something is sort of a more long-range chemical signaling versus maybe a local stress transmission? Or is there an obvious way of teasing apart the difference between when you are because we've talked today about local nearest neighbor interactions between things, And then also you have some sense of diffusion or sort of long-range propagation, right? Is there a signature, and can you think of ways of distinguishing which one is operating in a given case?
Actually, the mechanical stress propagates much farther than chemical signaling.
Yes, well,
So
depending on...
the long-range part and actually the fast transmitting part is the mechanical part, is not the chemical part.
Well, unless you have a liquid and then the stress the shear stress propagation isn't, right? So there's sort of different circumstances under which...
Right.
Yes, I agree
Because
with you. If you have a
short time,
solid,
yeah.
but it could be different.
Yeah. But actually, one important difference between, say, an active system and a passive system is the fact that the active system continuously consumes energy, and by that breaks the fluctuation dissipation theorem. So any system is very strongly constrained, close to equilibrium, by the fluctuation dissipation theorem. And there are a number of things which are forbidden because of that, which becomes allowed the minute you consume energy all the time. And this is maybe the most fundamental difference between a passive system close to equilibrium and an active system. Even though you can rescue, in some cases, fluctuation dissipation, which we also work on. But still there are, this is a very fundamental difference, and probably I would take it as a natural definition of an active system. And then you can do that in a huge number of different ways. But
if I may add, I think that's absolutely right, and I think some of that seems to be a play in all the very different systems that were talked about today. But I think in the one that Itai described in cartilage, that's why it would be very interesting to take away the cells. And because in some sense, so at this point, at least to me, it's a very interesting experiment, but it is not clear to me is how much is really just mechanical structure of this layer system with different orientation and so on, or some input of energy from the cells or from some chemical reaction or something. So it would be very interesting to do what you said you plan to do, which is kind of strip it down in various ways.
Well, we know, there are some tissues, like we were talking about formation. So one of the experiments that we're working on with Larry's group is you take some gel, some stuff where you just have collagen fibers that are put in, and then you seed it with cells. And the idea then is that you let the cells act on the collagen fibers and form stressed networks. And so, at the very least, the cells are important in setting up the structure of the network. And then the question of its mechanics maybe just comes down to, what structure you had. But in the setting up, the cells are very important.
Sorry, did I take it away?
No, that's okay.
Actually, might be out of line, because I was trying to say something to follow up what Jacques was telling about fluctuation, dissipation, violation, defining an active system. So you did say that, a system close to equilibrium is something where you expect fluctuation, dissipation to work. And if you put energy into any system and drive it far from whatever its equilibrium is, there's going to be no fluctuation, dissipation. I could imagine a normal fluid that is sheared and thermostatic and all bets are off. I thought that maybe for the considerations of the things that we are discussing today in this session, a better definition would be to say that the energy input has to go in a specific way. That is, if you drive the system at the boundary, for example, maybe that is something that you should understand as the non-equilibrium aspect of what you would think of as a passive system, or something like that.
Well, I also wanted to comment on the same issue, and I agree with the partner. So, an active system, so a system far from equilibrium not necessarily need to be active. So, a basic example of conduction, or even what we heard today about granular materials, when you put energy into the system, energy dissipates in the bulk due to inelastic collisions. So a particle itself is not active, but if you drive system, the system will be out of equilibrium and it is not necessarily active.
No, I disagree. So can I
Yes, I'm getting back there. So the question is FDT necessary and sufficient?
I mean, I understand what you mean, but it turns out that this system behaves exactly the same way. On long length scale, the minute you have bulk dissipation, for instance, if you vibrate rice grains collections, they behave like active pneumatics. And so, even though you would say a grain of rice maybe in itself is not really active, but if you provide energy to it, and if it's a collection of that, you can learn things about other systems which will be relieving system for some aspects, not all aspects of course, but for some aspects you might learn things. So it's not true that because the thing is in itself it's a dead system, but if you provide energy to it in some way, it will behave like an active system. And,
so I guess this question is, if you don't use rice grains, if you use billiard balls, do you want to call that an active system as well? And this is sort of the sense of
could be. I mean, it's just a matter if you manage to feed energy everywhere.
That's the
that's the issue.
Right.
Energy should come in as noise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
as long as
it
can come in noise through the motors are fine.
Locally.
Yeah.
But then are you implying then that this issue of boundaries comes in? Because in 2D, if you're vibrating, then I can imagine each particle is getting energy fed in. But in 3D, then it's just coming from the boundaries, and then that seems more like just Rayleigh-Bernard, where you get things far from equilibrium, but it's being externally driven, not each molecule is getting energy. I mean, is that a distinction worth making or not?
Not really. I mean, it depends on the question you are raising. But let's take the Rayleigh-Bernard instability. Take Rayleigh-Bernard, you would say, well, it's a passive system. I'm imposing a type of gradient, and I get some response. But if I want to understand let's say the large-scale behavior of the roll system, now, so I cross grain, and I want to know I want to write the hydrodynamical equation of this roll system. And if you so which Jacques did kind of long ago, and we did that about the same time. He was just faster than us, and I think we did it in a naive way. And I think now, from what I know now, I think we missed terms. And if I was to rewrite it, I would write an active two-dimensional symmetric. We wrote equations for just some kind of 2D symmetric, and we missed the active part. And I remember discussion with Pomo, and we missed this active part at that time. And I think now, being somewhat older, I would know how to do it. And so it really depends on what are the questions that you're raising, and so even Rayleigh-Bernard might give you active behavior. And another example, for instance, if you just take a Langmuir film, and you're not really careful, and you allow for evaporation through the Langmuir film, which is for most experiments, that's the way it is. It's extremely hard to control the vapor pressure on top of the Langmuir film. But if you allow for evaporation, this thing is an active system, PIGO, if you want to describe the long-range dynamics. And there are good, there are very nice experiments actually which show that. Oh, just a word. I mean, I said something about breaking the fluctuation dissipation, but there are ways to rescue that. But there are specific. I mean, for all Markovian systems, I can show that you can rescue a fluctuation dissipation theory, but it's very restrictive compared to the thermal one. in the sense that there's only one choice of variable which will give you that, whereas for the normal fluctuation dissipation theorem, it's all choices of variable which will give you the fluctuation dissipation. But there's still a strong difference.
So by the way, we don't absolutely have to talk about large global issues. If there are specific things you wanted to ask and that I cut you off for, that's also fair game. Please.
I had a question specifically on the interfacial tension of cellular bodies. I'm wondering if the position where cell division occurs is important in that case. In other words, I'm assuming that cell division is happening in the bulk of the cellular body, but is it, if it were happening at the interface, would that have implications on the developing interfacial tension?
So do I understand your question that one should treat separately this outside layer? That really depends on well, in a sense, it would be the same for a fluid. It's only at some kind of coarse graining level that surface tension has a meaning, and it's true for cells, and it's true for a fluid as well. So the general answer would be, you're totally right, that if you want a level of description which takes into account the molecular structure or the cell structure, that very layer has to be identified and treated in a different way. So, in principle, we should have a discrete description for that layer, for instance, which is a level of sophistication that we didn't really introduce. But this is, and if we need to, we'll do that one day. But and it's really, it's just the same kind of question that if you want to understand nucleation in fluids, to really address properly the question, you have to go to molecular dynamics. This kind of macroscopic arguments which I've been giving for fluids are just a rule of thumb which allows you to understand what's going on in a rough way. But if you want to understand in a detailed way, it's extremely difficult. Dan Frankel has done very beautiful things for nucleation of crystals, colloidal crystals, for instance, and it's very subtle. But if you want the global picture, the answer is what we did is just a global picture. And if you want detailed pictures, it's orders of magnitude more difficult, even in fluids.
During your talk, you proposed some alternative to the current treatments for cancer, which is to try to kill the cancer cells faster than you kill the healthy tissue. You said you could possibly increase the steady state tension of the healthy tissue so the cancer cells would die. And can you give me any way of conceiving what that would look like? Because I have no idea of what that would entail. Do you have any?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What would
I think it would probably take, 15 years, 20 years to give, to find what drug could help. This one idea you could have is just crank up the steady state pressure of normal tissue. But maybe it's naive, because maybe if you crank up the steady state pressure, you also crank up blood pressure, for instance, right? And then you're not so safe. So there's years and years of work to see what is more intelligent and so on. So it's just saying there's one more direction to look at, but it's not giving you the answer. It might be a wrong idea. But it's certainly an idea to be proposed and studied.
So, but if you would increase the pressure of the surrounding healthy tissue, wouldn't that just lead to a tumor growing in the healthy tissue? Because this healthy tissue is surrounded by other tissue. If you now increase this pressure, then it would just go to the other ones, or?
It's a good point. You would have to increase all of the others. That's right. And then, in fact, the
Could you just decrease the cancer?
Oh, you could decrease the cancer. I mean, it's just sufficient. I mean, this is the difference which is important. So, what and probably it's easier to decrease. Well, I don't know. I mean, but it's certainly one direction to look at. I mean, if you could increase all the by some margin all of the steady state pressure of the normal tissues, that could work. And it doesn't need to be, I mean, the tissue must be more or less out there with steady pressure. So, and then you have signaling. I mean, what, for instance, differentiation between your stomach cells and the esophagus cells is due to acidity. So even though, so you may have some flexibility, for instance. Even though the pressure might not be really appropriate, because maybe it's not so important because it's really acidity which controls the switch between the two tissues.
I just have a question about the idea of the steady state pressure. I mean, the idea is that we have a piece of tissue, we prevent it from expanding, and you have two things going on, division, proliferation, and apoptosis, right? And the pressure at which those are balanced is what we're calling a steady state pressure, right? But if you exert a pressure on a cell, you can get it to change volume. It'll shrink down. I mean, is that accounted for here? Are we allowing for cells to change size as well?
Yes. I mean, I messed up the video, so I didn't have time to give details. I'm sorry. We do introduce the size dependence.
Oh, okay.
But that's
it just changes the game in my mind if you allow the cells themselves to compress versus only allowing
they do. I mean, you can see that, and but it doesn't change the main feature that at some point it will stop, right? And so that's one thing which, I mean, if you read the books on biology, they will tell you that at confluence, the tissues stop dividing or something like that. And so inactivation at confluence or whatever. And at confluence, I mean, you have to put numbers. What does it mean? And it means that of course they are dealing with rigid boundaries, and when they get to the when cells touch, they see that they start the tissue stops to grow. But if they were putting a barrier and measuring pressure, then they would be much more sensitive, and we would learn a lot. And because somehow if you have rigid boundaries, pressure cranks up tremendously for slight changes in shape or in volume. And so I think it's just the wrong idea to say that they stop dividing at confluence.
May I change the topic a little bit? So one of the things that I found fascinating in Arshad's talk is you start seeing your movers with the head and the tail. They actually jam at very small volume fractions, very low volume fractions. You start seeing them form little clots. So I guess one thing was I wanted to ask, do you have some sense of what the microscopic dynamics are that makes them jam? Second is this a lesson? Is this something to be generalized? Should we be understanding that somehow in these systems with anisotropic motions, should we be expecting jamming at generally lower thresholds? Is there, do you have some view or anybody else have something to say about that?
It's a good question. So supposing you have things walking in the same direction, and would they aggregate more because simply they want to walk in a certain direction, come together, form a cluster, and that cluster is harder to break? Whether that leads to jamming at a lower volume fraction, I don't know the answer to yet. Clearly, I mean, in that case, you can stuff more particles into that space. We're still, you observed that it was around 50%, 60%, and it was essentially not moving. But perhaps one could shake them for a day or a week, and maybe you would have some isolated thing. So clearly, the volume fraction in which they seem to be jamming is lower than, say, if they were spherical, where in 2 dimensions you can almost get up to crystalline packing. So it's a good question, and it's one of the. I would like to probe that question.
Yeah, there are other systems that in which directed motion always gets you stuck, either in ordered states or disordered states, much lower than in equilibrium. Can you unjam by shaking harder? Is this question?
Not necessarily. What you can do is maybe you can shake them so much that they may flip directions, okay, and then maybe it will move a little bit more. Whether that means that it's now unjammed or it's just gone to a new configuration and soon get stuck, I don't know the answer. To find the critical point is very hard.
Finish the sentence.
But it's a general broad question which very nicely framed whether these directed movers will diffuse differently than normal diffusion. Perhaps not. And whether they will jam at a different point than they would if they were not directional movers. For example, if you had cohesive interactions, you could imagine that they would jam sooner. So is this directed motion acting like a cohesive unit between the particle? Think of different ways where you can argue one way or the other.
So while watching the movie that you showed in the talk, I thought, so I'm just trying to clarify whether what I thought was right or wrong. With respect to the movies that Narayan and company had with rods that moved both ways, it seems that in each shape they can, change the direction in which they acquire the long axis velocity. While in the case of the polar particle that you had, it doesn't change. It always moves in the same direction, right? At each shape.
So they are doing random walks. So you have the polar particles. They also do backward walks. So if you ask a velocity autocorrelation, it decays very rapidly. Okay? The direction in which they're walking is a much slower decay, if you like. So so it's taking steps. If you like, 4 steps forward, 1 step backward, left and right. So that's their natural state. Once they're inside a collection of other particles, of course, they can't turn around, so they want to go in.
Yeah, there's negligible rotational diffusion of any sort, right? I mean, they keep going in more or less straight lines if you had one line.
No, there is orientational diffusion, and that is of order of, depending on the substrate that they're being shaken on, so you can tune that. Full body lengths of motion versus half body length of motion. So depending, you can tune that. There's nothing particular about it. You just choose the length of the walker.
So if you are able to promote rotational diffusion by changing the substrate properties,
right,
can you avoid this whole jamming thing happening at such a low density?
Yes, in fact, so that was the difference between, if you like, the movies at the end where we managed to create enough noise and rotational diffusion that they actually didn't go to the boundaries. Whereas in the first,
I'm not thinking of that movie though. I think maybe I'm not being very clear.
It was a movie where you form clumps in the bulk.
Yes.
Right. So again, if you increase the noise, so if you vibrate it greater, and therefore injected more noise to the particles, then indeed they created more space around them and they could turn and they formed a more uniform system. So you could make particles aggregate at the boundaries, or you could get a more uniform, weak swirling state, depending on the noise that you have.
So probably at this point we should thank the speakers very much and send you off to lunch.
So we come back at 2:00.